Anyway, we're going to be talking about the Roaring Twenties. But before we do, I would like to call for a roaring round of applause for Amity, Matt, and Colleen, and the rest of the staff who've done such a superb job in putting on this Centennial celebration. Very good. Okay. You know, there's been a lot of talk by previous panelists about the importance of history, and I pretty much agree with them. But one has to be careful about which history one is talking about. And I'm reminded of sort of a Russian, I don't know whether you'd call it an aphorism or a witticism or what, but one Russian talking to another saying, "We know what our future is. Our questions are all about what our past was." So if you're going to learn from history, you need to understand what the past is. And I would say when it comes to the Roaring Twenties, there are an awful lot of myths that certainly I got when I was in school, and I imagine some of you did, maybe not everyone, I hope not everyone. But there are a lot of myths about just what went on in the 20s. For instance, it was considered a period of, real frivolity, kind of a figment of F. Scott Fitzgerald's imagination, populated with flappers and bootleggers and you name it, I guess stockbrokers. We can't leave them out. Anyway, and it is frequently dismissed in American history as a period of time we can brush over lightly so we can get to important things like the Depression. I think, and I hope I'll convince you before we're through, that the 20s was actually one of the most transformational periods in American history and was very important to, to how we evolved. And as many of you know, probably the biggest myth about the 20s is it led directly to the Great Depression. Well, you all have heard of fake news, right? Yeah, well, this is fake history. So we're going to try and set the record straight. I have a terrific panel for doing that. On my left, I have John Allison, who is arguably the most successful banker of our time. He ran BB&T for what, 20 years? John?
Yes, sir.
And took the assets from something under $5 billion to almost $200 billion in that period of time. So he's, give him a round of applause. And then ask him why I didn't tell you about the stock. Anyway, but here is a man who understands growth and how it happened, so it's very appropriate to have him on a panel talking about the Roaring Twenties. We also have, John Cochran. Your looks have improved since I turned to the left. We also have John Cochran, who is a very distinguished and very important economist. I am not going to read all of John's list of honors and accomplishments, otherwise we would, take up the rest of the time here, because he's really a very distinguished economist, but he is going to chime in on just how important the 20s were and some of the environment that created the 20s. And finally, we have Matt Denhart, who, as I think most of you know, is president of the Coolidge Foundation. And, he and Amity have built this into a spectacular, I'd call it a juggernaut in, American institutions today. And it's just getting started. So, one of the things I love about the Coolidge Foundation is the scholarship program. Because in that program, we start out with 30,000 applicants, and each one of them has to read the autobiography, correct me if I'm wrong, Matt, of Calvin Coolidge, and then write several essays about it. And in a sense, you could say, this is our subversive way of making sure that fake history gets crowded out by real history. So I think it's a great program beyond just, the obvious attributes of the program. Anyway, before I turn to my panelists, who are terrific, and I always said, and when I was running a company, don't hire people who are stupider than you are just because you're afraid someone smarter might upstage you. Hire smart people, because then you don't have to work as hard and they'll make you richer. And I've applied that principle to the panel we have here today. So they're going to be great in helping set the stage, if you will. Anyway, I'm not going to bore you with an enormous number of statistics, but I am going to give you some data points, so kind of, as I say, to set the stage for what went on in the Roaring '20s. And let's start with what they called in those days GNP. John can probably explain how they changed to GDP. I can't, other than it came earlier in the alphabet. Maybe we'll have GAP someday, I don't know. But anyway, but GNP during the period of the 20s grew annually by a rate of 4.9%. Now, some of you who paid close attention earlier, and it sort of shocked me, heard Diana say it grew at a rate of 3.5% or some such number. All I can tell you is when you're delivering statistics and trying to make a point, make sure you choose the right base year. Anyway, I asked Matt to see if we could find some kind of data on median household income and how it progressed. Anyway, things were so rudimentary then, and Coolidge didn't want to gum up the government with a lot of useless statistical agencies. So the best we could come up with was the rate of growth in per capita GNP. And during the 20s, it grew by 40%. And you can assume that is a proxy for what household income did during that period. Anyway, another fairly dry statistic, but one you encounter all the time, is unemployment during that period. As someone mentioned, we came out of World War I in pretty bad shape with unemployment approaching 12%. Under Coolidge and his administration, unemployment fell to 3.2%, even lower than the employment rate that President Biden boasts about, and he doesn't mention that he's paying people not to work, so it's a different era. Anyway, those are the background. There are two other things that happened that I'd like to spend a little more time on, and that is the 20s, and this is why I say it was a transformative period. The 20s really gave birth to a 100-year love affair with the automobile. At the start of the decade, we produced and sold 1.5 million automobiles a year. By the end of the decade, that number was 4.5 million. Did I say billion earlier? Million is what I'm trying to say. And when you think about it, the population has roughly tripled, so the per capita consumption of automobiles wasn't very different from what it is today, which is extraordinary. And if you think about it, that kind of transformed what American life was about. We have become an automotive society and moved away from, thank God, a horse and buggy society. Let me point out one other thing that I think was of great importance in the daily life we lead today, and it's very easy to take these things for granted. But during the 20s, American households were electrified. I mean, they got electric, utilities supplying. At the beginning of the 20s, only 35% of American households had electricity. By the end of the 20s, that was almost 70%. And if you exclude farmers who are way away from the grid, it was almost 90%. So there was a huge transformation. And I like to think of it as it was the great battle of Westinghouse with its resident genius Tesla and General Electric with its resident genius Steinmetz. Well, you all know the sequel to this story. Tesla has a car named after him. But poor Steinmetz, no one could figure out how someone would proudly say, "I drive a Steinmetz." So he's been a little bit lost to history. But you know, Westinghouse and GE did a phenomenal job. I'm gonna tell you one little anecdote about GE and Steinmetz. In the 20s, my great-grandfather happened to be chairman of GE, so this is kind of a family lore, if you will. Maybe apocryphal, but we'll assume it's not. So my great-grandfather goes up to Steinmetz after the election, and he says, "Steiny, who did you vote for?" Steiny said, "I voted for the Republicans." And he said, "What? Steiny, I thought you were a socialist. I thought that's why you had to leave Germany." Steinmetz said, "I was until my salary went over $5,000 a year." So, you know, the point I would like to make beyond a funny story is that what was going on in the 20s, the roaring boom, the optimism, you know, and the environment of the 20s was enough to convert a dyed-in-the-wool socialist to capitalism. So, you know, that's pretty neat. Anyway, we talked about during that time the national debt, which Coolidge inherited, $25 billion, reduced it to $16 billion. The Dow Jones went from $63 to $381, and these are all indices of the great thing. And people say, well, then what happened? Well, in fact, I actually did a calculation. If you had bought stock at $381 a share, or if you'd bought into the Dow at that time, and if you just held on until today, you would have compounded your money at about 5% a year. So it wasn't disastrously high. It might not be great. I wouldn't want to invest money quite at that rate, but it wasn't quite the disaster. Finally, let me just finish on this point. As I said earlier, one of the great myths, in my opinion, about the 20s is that it led, you know, more or less directly, maybe indirectly, to the Great Depression. And I hope by the time we're finished with this panel, sometime in the next 60 minutes, we will be able to disabuse everyone in this room of that idea and show exactly what did contribute to the Great Depression and why the stock market crash in '29 wasn't merely a correction, of which we've had a lot, but the prelude to a Great Depression. It wasn't the stock markets that caused it. And I won't give you any more hints, but we will talk about it later on. Anyway, I hope the stage is set. John, I'll turn it over to you. Tell us how banking is performed.
Thank you very much. Coolidge was with a dramatic contrast with both his primary predecessor, Woodrow Wilson, and his immediate successors, Herbert Hoover and Franklin Roosevelt. Well, his philosophy was clearly not fully integrated. He had a clear set of philosophical principles that drove most of his major decisions. He was an advocate of individual rights, free markets, and limited government. To finance World War I, the U.S. under Wilson massively increased government spending and debt. At the same time, the Federal Reserve significantly expanded the money supply, ultimately raising interest rates, effectively reducing the health of the economy. There were many intrusions in the economy. For example, the railroad industry was nationalized. Coolidge understood that it was his responsibility to lead by restoring the principles underlying a free society. He led a tremendous effort to deregulate the economy, reduce government debt, reduce government spending, and cut taxes. The strategy unleashed American entrepreneurs and the American workforce and led to a period of innovation, creativity, and productivity. The combination created a significant improvement in economic well-being for practically everyone. The list of advances in the 1920s is pretty amazing. There was a dramatic increase in automobile ownership, huge expansion of the road system. Radio became available, broadening the individual's knowledge of the world. Electrical distribution was created, expanding opportunities for many different types of home appliances, and supported industrial development. The telephones were being installed at a rapid pace. And the list goes on. Coolidge's principle of individual liberty, free markets, and limited government created an incredible improvement in the quality of life. Unfortunately, what is taught in most schools and therefore commonly held belief is that the Roaring Twenties led to the Great Depression. This is simply not true. It was a radical change in policy by Hoover and Franklin Roosevelt that both created the Great Depression and extended its duration. Coolidge's principles of good government were attacked by Hoover and then Roosevelt. There was a huge increase in taxes, massive increase in regulation, and government interferences in many business activity. If Coolidge's principles had not been violated, it is highly unlikely that we would have ever had the Great Depression, and we probably wouldn't have had World War II. I want to speak from a personal perspective with potentially help the students here, which I view as the audience I really want to focus on, to turn Coolidge's principles, his understandings, into a productive and moral life. In my career, I have experienced the significant benefits of reducing regulations, as Coolidge did, and the destructive negatives of increasing regulation, as Hoover did. I joined BB&T in 1971. At that time, it was a small Eastern North Carolina farm bank. I want to tell you a story because that's what CEOs do, and that's what I was. They're storytellers. At the beginning of the Great Depression, there was a run on banks because of fear that banks would all go broke. BB&T at that time had a deposit relationship with a local post office. When the bank run started, customers used the withdrawal of money from the bank and put it in open savings accounts at the post office. The post office, fortunately, would bring the money to BB&T's back door and deposit it in the post office account. The BB&T teller would count out the money very slowly, and he was running out even doing that. But fortunately, about lunchtime, the Federal Reserve's Brinks truck showed up, and the guards slowly unloaded all the money, bags of money, into the bank vault for all to see. Seeing the bank had plenty of money, the customers went home. When a few years later, Roosevelt ordered all banks to close because so many banks were failing. The board of BB&T ignored the order, claiming that they did not get it, which is extremely unlikely. BB&T was one of the very few banks that stayed open all the way through the Depression. This independent characteristic was built into the culture of the bank when I joined it. I became chairman and CEO in 1989 and was in this role for 20 years. During my tenure, BB&T grew to become the 10th largest bank in the U.S. We had 20 consecutive years of record earnings, and we're in the top 10% of banks in the world in overall performance. We were competing with much larger financial institutions, yet we were consistently gaining market share. We had by far the lowest employee turnover and the best customer retention of any major bank. We invested far more in employee education than our competitors. We operated the BB&T universities where employees had the opportunity to master their responsibilities and earn promotions. We had a very small advertising budget, but spent far more on employee education than our competitors. Because we had highly trained employees, we operated a very decentralized set of community banks who had a much higher level of decision-making authority than our competitors, which was a foundation for happier customer relationships. Our organization was driven by a clearly defined set of values. While our values were expressed differently, underlying these values were Coolidge's concepts of individual rights, free markets, and limited government. When I joined the banking industry, it was highly regulated, slow growth, and had limited profitability. It was also a very fragmented industry. During the late 1970s, to pay off the debt from the Vietnam War, the Federal Reserve significantly expanded the money supply one more time, leading to rapid inflation, causing many small banks and savings and loans to fail. In order to fix the problems, when the regulators come to help you, you're in trouble. To fix the problems they had made, regulators encouraged savings and loans to expand their commercial lending portfolio. Remember, they had financed houses traditionally, and where they had no expertise, which led to massive overbuilding that created a crash in real estate markets, and many small banks and thrifts failed in the early 1990s. In order to encourage healthy banks like BB&T to make loans, there was a major reduction in regulations, giving banks opportunities to make acquisitions, expand their product offering, and open new markets. Exactly what Coolidge's underlying philosophy would support. Unfortunately, in the mid-2000s, politicians and regulators strongly encouraged banks to make subprime loans to raise the percentage of individuals who owned houses. Clearly a Hoover-Roosevelt strategy, right? Unfortunately, many of the buyers could not afford the houses, and the subprime home market collapsed. At that time, the regulators put incredible pressure and restriction on healthy banks, in contrast to what they did in the early 1990s. I decided to retire as CEO from BB&T because I knew we were going into a regulatory nightmare that indefinitely how long it would last. My goal was to fight individual rights. I became the president and CEO of the Cato Institution, the world's leading libertarian think tank, and I would like to thank Calvin Coolidge for the ideas that underlie individual rights, free markets, and limited government. Thank y'all.
John, one question before we move on. Should Coolidge have permitted interstate banking? I don't think it was permitted in his time.
It was not permitted in his time. I think that would have been a great idea. I don't think the industry was regular. He would have run into massive political, because you had thousands of small banks and they all had political power, so I don't think it could have been done. But yeah, it would have been great if he'd just allowed something to happen on interstate banking. And we'd ended up with a healthier economy, particularly during the Great Depression.
Well, that was about the only thing he missed. But anyway, when he comes back, he can work on that one. Thank you very much, John. We have a lot of Johns up here. Dr. Cochran.
Thanks, John. No, I don't go by doctor. That's so pretentious. So my job here is to talk about the economy of the 1920s. I'm an economist, by the way. The 1920s were the single most consequential decade for the lives of everyday Americans. This is when the contours of modern life happened, pretty much all in one decade. When we think of technologies and changes, there's an S shape. Something's invented, it trundles along for a couple decades, it becomes a toy of the rich maybe. Then there's a vast period of diffusion quickly, and then we spend another couple decades making it better. Think of airplanes, cars, anything you can look at. The 1920s was the coincidence of the middle of the S-curve on so many things that are important, and that's what made it the defining decade. It's not about just accumulation of stuff. It's about changing the way people lived. Everyday people lived their lives all at once. So electricity, depend on your numbers, from 30% to 70% of homes got electrified. And the electricity was better, AC, standardized, and with that came appliances, electric lights instead of kerosene lamps. Electric appliances, the iron, the toaster, the washing machine, the vacuum cleaner. Which was the most popular, by the way? Which one diffused the first? No, actually, it was the electric iron. And just think, this is where we're a little bit guilty of male-centered history. Think of the job of ironing shirts with a coal stove and a coal iron. Yuck. Electric iron, number one. The official measures way understate this. Consider light. In 1920, you had to burn on a flame. In 1929, you turn on a light bulb. The quality of that light is what was important, not just having 1,000 candles. And this revolutionized home life and the unending drudgery of it. By the way, we learned yesterday, in 1923, the Coolidge home, the president's home, had no electricity or telephone when Harding died. How things have changed. Not just in the home. In 1914, 30% of manufacturing was electrified. By 1929, 70%. Just think of a factory with no electricity in it, and maybe some big belts and steam stuff going around, versus a factory that's all electrified. Where did the electricity had to get to the houses? Why? How? Wires, right? Massive infrastructure. Where'd that come from? Was there a big federal program? Was there a stimulus and infrastructure? Nope. That was done by private utilities. Automobiles. In 1920, 20% of people had them. 60% of families owned a car in 1929. And we just, boom, the automobile revolution in one decade. Then total vehicles per households was 90% by 1929. This wasn't just the convenience. This is a massive change in your life. Trucks and buses also dominated the roads by 1929. By the way, railroads actually increased the number of horses because he needed the last mile problem. And as far as the environment's concerned, horse poop. This was an amazing revolution to change. Even the cars then, which were pretty dirty, it was an amazing revolution in the ways. But it changed people's lives. You didn't just get to go places more conveniently. People used to have to live right near a soot emitting factory where they worked. Now they could move to suburbs. So the beginning of moving away to a much more pleasant life, well, that was the car that made that possible. And rural isolation. I mean, imagine living on a farm when you have to take a horse to get to town. One number said that by 1929, 93% of farmers had cars to get them down. And they said the car was the number one thing. They didn't care about the electricity or anything else. The car to connect them. The transportation revolution. We're talking now about the transportation revolution in a decade, a transportation revolution. How did that happen? Was there tax breaks, subsidies? I live in Palo Alto. I know my neighbor's house was worth $5 million. The federal government gave him $7,500 to buy a Tesla so he can drive down to his private jet in a Tesla rather than Did we have federal subsidies? Nope, zero. Did we have a federal plan? Did we have a transition plan? Absolutely no. And of course, along with the invention of the gas station. In 1920, you bought gasoline at the hardware store in cans. The filling station got invented in 1929. Was there an Inflation Reduction Act? The most hilariously named act in recent memory, but nonetheless. Did we need billions of dollars to fill South Dakota with filling stations? No. The filling stations came in all on their own when people figured out they could make money doing it. Communication, telephone, phonograph, radios, movies, this all came from zero to a pervasive feature of everybody's life. Radio from zero to half of the houses. And most people also, they had a neighbor or something. The radio, you don't just need a radio, you need to invent who's going to say something on the radio. The whole idea of broadcasts, broadcast networks, that all happened in the 1920s as well. The whole idea of mass media didn't exist in 1920. It was a pervasive feature of everybody's life in 1929. And imagine how that changes their lives. And again, how did that happen? A plan, a subsidy, industrial policy. Nope. As usual, pretty much everything happened despite the government, if not, rather than because. Indoor plumbing, water, sewer, and gas. These all were practically absent in 1920 and practically universal in 1930. How many of you used an outhouse lately? That was the standard way of pretty much all Americans in 1920 and not in 1920. Think about fetching water from a pump. Think about starting your stove made of coal and cooking over a coal stove. That all changed in one decade for average Americans. Infant mortality plunged. Doctors started to know what they're doing. That perhaps, those of you who are not parents will be parents, and that one tugs at the heartstrings more than just about anything else. This was the S shape. Now, all of it was still primitive. The Model T is not as good as the average Toyota. The radio and the silent movies versus TV, Google, Netflix. But imagine the isolation and drudgery of life before them, the fetching water in the cold, the washing all your stuff by hand. Innovations in finance. Consumer credit was invented. 75% of new vehicles were financed in 1926, and that spread to household appliances. That helped people to be able to afford these wonderful new things. The shopping experience. You used to have to go to the general store and negotiate literally over the price of your bread, which was behind an outlet. Fixed prices, chain stores. Sears moved from catalog to store, and of course you could go to the store in your car now. National chains, there were 7,500 outlets in 1920, 30,000 in 1930, 15,000 of those by A&P alone. That was the Walmart and Amazon of its day, but think about that change of experience from the horse down to the general store to being able to drive down to the Sears and get what you want. The numbers are good numbers. We talked about them. The average earnings rose 30% in a decade. GDP rose. But that hides the dramatic transformation. If you knew GDP rose by a third, you say, oh, people have 3 kerosene lamps, not 2. People say, oh, I got 2 horses, not a Model T. I've got indoor plumbing. I don't have a his and hers outhouse, which would be a doubling of income. GDP is not meant to measure human welfare. It's meant to measure income. Look at the lights in this room. The GDP of the lights, I figure probably, $50 on the electric bill for this entire meeting? Think if we had to do it by candles. It would have been thousands of dollars. Way more GDP, but way less benefit to us. It just isn't made to capture. It's a fine measure, but it's not made to capture what happened to people's life. The greatest economic and lifestyle revolution in American life for middle class and lower middle class people happened with basically no guidance whatsoever from the federal government. It just simply failed to make worse the existing impediments to progress and largely stayed out of the way. And nobody really worried that much about equity. Think, how important would it be, if we would think back and the government had really said, look, you have 2 horses, I have 1 horse. That's a problem. We all need to have 1.5 horses, which they probably would do by chopping the horse in half. Versus, let's all get Model Ts. Of course, think of how much better off we are now. Is it terrible that rich people had to buy it for twice the price in 1924 and poor people waited to 1927? Would we look back and wish they had all slowed it down in the name? And today we worry about jobs and artificial intelligence. What about all those horseshoe makers and the piano makers who fell apart? The kerosene lamp makers. No, they all got jobs too. Don't worry about AI taking the jobs. It's all the same. Now that's microeconomics. There's also macroeconomics. That's the most important, by the way. The overall growth, the living standards of basic people. But it needs a backdrop of stable macroeconomics, stable institutions. And as we mentioned before, it looked a lot in some ways like today. There was a war, much bigger than the war we're seeing right now. A pandemic, much worse than the pandemic we're seeing right now. Inflation, way worse than the inflation we're seeing right now. And a background of U.S. federal debt, but also a massive debt in Europe and hyperinflation and revolution in Russia. And yes, I think culture wars. There was a lot of communists around and a serious question whether we would go the same way. Well, I won't repeat the whole first panel, but there was the first great supply-side tax cut by Coolidge and Mellon, dropping the top rate from 70% in 1917 to 25%. That can be done. In 1982 to 1986, in the Reagan administration, with Tip O'Neill, some bipartisanship, cut it from 70% to 28%. That's possible. Now, where are we now? We're in the 40% range and arguing about it. But principles of taxation. What matters is not the federal income tax. What matters is all taxes together. The wedge between what you produce for your employer and what you get to eat in the end. And you have to add up federal tax, state tax, local taxes, payroll taxes, sales taxes, property taxes, your share of the income, of the corporate income taxes, estate taxes. I asked lots of experts in taxation, and none of them can name their own personal marginal rate within 20 percentage points. I think there's a reason for that. If we knew it, the peasants and pitchforks would be out there mad as heck. But we are, guesses are in the 70% range on the top marginal rate. We're ready for that again. And revenue rose, as everyone mentioned. In fact, revenue rose from the rich people as well. A lot of that from compliance, getting rid of the Swiss cheese of legal loopholes. What does that tell us? I think as Steve said earlier, he started saying tax cut, and then he said, no, wait. Never say the word tax cut. Say tax rate cut. That's the important thing. That's where the incentive is. And you cut the tax rate, and often you get rid of the loopholes too. You often get more tax revenue. So promise me from now on in, you'll pay attention to the incentives first, and you'll say the words tax rate cut, not tax cut, because that's what we're talking about. That wasn't easy. Democrats and progressive Republicans wanted, boy, does these things sound like just today, targeting the tax cuts at the lower income people, keeping taxes on the rich and the progressivity, and we'll change the tax laws to stop the illegal, the avoidance, and we'll give the IRS more money. Things don't change that much, do they? Deficits, well, thrifty Cal, but that was not hard. There was plenty of mischief at work. The Congress had plenty of ideas for spending. But each year in the 20s, the federal government generated a surplus. There's this thing called a surplus. It's ancient history. We use the word deficit, but there's this strange thing that can happen when the government takes in more money than it spends. And Calvin Coolidge and Mellon and the Congress managed it every year in the 1920s and reduced the federal debt. And the economy boomed. So much for stimulus, so much for secular stagnation. The economy boomed even though they were running a steady surplus and reducing the debt. Inflation. We have a little inflation now. We're all mad about it. Nothing like 1919s. From 1914, the price level was 100. 1918, it had gone up to 150, 50% cumulative inflation. By 1920, 199.7. Price level had doubled. That's some serious inflation. You know, we might have had 15% altogether. That was 100%. 1922, it went down from 199 to 170 and stayed there until 1920. Inflation was conquered quickly. The story is a little bit about the gold standard, but a lot about, so I do the fiscal theory of the price level, and we learned this morning how the Budget Act was the crucial action that gave people faith the government was not going to go down. What was happening in Europe? Hyperinflation. 10 to the many powers kinds of hyperinflation in Germany and Austria. We weren't going to go down that rate, and it happened and cured inflation. There was a recession, 1920, just before Coolidge came on the board. A big recession. Why? Well, basics is you cut the price. You have a 30% deflation. 15% deflation to stop the inflation, and there's going to be a bit of a recession. But it was short and sharp, and it ended very quickly. People went back to work. What did the government do about it? Nothing. Where was the stimulus? Where was the bailouts? Where was the transfers? Nope. With lesson learned, recessions can end very quickly if the government will get out of the way, allow prices to adjust, and don't do much fixing of things. Now, let's turn to policy, and what did the government do here? Policy was not all roses. Lots of things were not working well. For example, the government's major transportation policy initiative. Was that to at least get us all in cars? No, it was the ICC regulation of railroad rates. They thought the major problem was going to be who pays how much in railroads. Didn't even occur to them that we're going to all change to cars and trucks within 10 years, which eventually killed the railroads. Tariffs were high, immigration restrictions. What did Coolidge do? This is supposed to be a conference about Coolidge, and he's been absent so far in my comments. Mostly constraining mischief. On the microeconomics, one source I looked at said he appointed commissioners to the Federal Trade Commission and the Interstate Commerce Commission who did little to restrict the activities of business under their jurisdiction. The regulatory state under Coolidge was thin to the point of invisibility. He vetoed farm subsidies twice. Lots of bad ideas came up, and Coolidge's job was to say no. Interestingly, what I understand of Coolidge is, and Amity may correct us, he was not personally a free market crusader. His instincts, his policy preferences were quite progressive. But his view was that those were state and local matters that was unbecoming, that the federal government was not allowed to do. He did what he did out of respect for the institutions, more than as the leader of an ideological crusade that we might agree with. And I think that is perhaps the most wonderful thing. If we would only respect the institutions, we wouldn't need to try to appoint somebody who has our ideas, and if in a democracy somebody with bad ideas comes in, they'll have bad things. Let's fix the institutions. Will Rogers said, this is a great quote I got from yesterday, he didn't do nothing, but that's what they wanted done. That's utterly wrong. Coolidge did hard work, which we heard about this morning on the taxes, to beat back bureaucratic expansion. hard work to cut the taxes, hard work to restrain the spending, hard work to say no to endless bad ideas. Hard work to do the institutional reform of putting in a budget process. Historians, who are mostly from the left, praise the great leaders who lead us in great moments, largely to expand the government and often to make worse crises of their own making. I guess we'll talk about the Great Depression in a minute. What about leaders who stay out of the way, do their bit to improve the machinery of the government, work valiantly to fight the weeds, to preserve and strengthen the institutions of American government? We should celebrate as our greatest leaders, the fixers, the quiet reformers, the minders of the store, the preservers of our institution, not the crusaders who are often the Pied Pipers. His motto was normalcy. Stop it. Don't be transformative. Fix these rotten institutions. And that, when I look at surveys of what Americans want, is exactly what Americans want today. The vast majority of them. No, please, not some other great plan. Normalcy.
Thank you, Joe. That was a great presentation. Matt, do you have anything to add to that?
Not much. How do you follow John Allison, John Childs, and John Cochran? Well, you can have a different name. Maybe you'll be memorable in that way. Anyhow, I'll share a few thoughts, maybe fill in a data point or two that John Cochran probably just didn't have time to get to, and then talk a bit about the Great Depression, where I think our conversation is going next. So as Mr. Childs opened our panel saying that there's a myth that the 1920s, the exuberance you often hear, caused the Great Depression, or it was a necessary correction, that of course this sort of out of control environment, both in the way people lived and the way they invested and the way that they ran their businesses and their lives, had to cause a crash, and that was the retribution for the irresponsibility of the era. Well, the evidence doesn't really seem to suss that out, but the myth continues today. In fact, just in the last day or two, I saw a tweet from a well-known tweeter, and it said, "Those who praise Calvin Coolidge remind me of a story of the man who jumped out of the top of the Empire State Building, and as he was falling down, people inside heard him say, 'So far, so good. So far, so good.'" Of course, the implication being that in the 20s, things seemed good before they came literally crashing down and ended in disaster of Great Depression. And then we had to do our penance for a decade before we could sort of try to get our way out. Well, let's look at the evidence. I'll look at three different sets of policies, and I want to compare a recession that we just heard about from John Cochran that you almost never hear about otherwise, which was the recession of the early 1920s with the Great Depression of the late 1920s. So when you say, the recession of the 20s, people always assume you're talking about the Depression. It's important to ask which one. And I'll look at three different policy areas, the responses to those. The first being federal spending. I'll probably breeze through the early 20s because Dr. Cochran covered that quite well. The second being tax policy, and the third being labor and wages. So to kind of summarize, the downturn of the early 1920s was very severe. There was a bad recession, bad inflation, really bad inflation as we heard. Real GNP per capita fell more than 15% between 1919 and 1921. The unemployment rate was above 11%. The Dow Jones Industrial Average dropped about 30% in the year 1920 alone. If you looked at that today, that would be like going from, we're about 34,000 right now. That would be like dropping to 23,000 or so. So it would be rather dramatic. So what was the response to this bad recession? First, let's look at spending. Nowadays, we believe in counter-cyclical fiscal policy. We say when there's a downturn, the government ought to spend money to try to increase demand, which will help us in recovery. But in the early 1920s, the government did the opposite. It pulled back, it spent less. There was no stimulus, and the recession, despite the recession, the budget of the federal government continued to shrink. I guess you'd expect that somewhat. We were coming out of World War I, where spending was dramatically high. You would expect it to come down some. But even in a year of a bad recession, 1920-21, it continued to come down. Well, spending didn't just come down. It came down enough that there were surpluses in those years, and they used that surplus to help pay down the federal debt. Today, even in boom years, we don't manage to pay down the federal debt, but in the 1920s, debt reduction was pursued despite the severe recession. Second, tax policy. We've heard that first under the Wilson administration, and then of course under Harding Coolidge, tax rates came down dramatically from 77% eventually to 25%. I think something, maybe a point to add to Dr. Cochran's comments was certainly clarity and simplicity was an important part of that. The 1920 GOP platform put right there in writing the plan that Harding and Coolidge would then enact almost to perfection. It promised lower rates, but also a much simpler tax system. They thought it was far too complex. They would probably be rolling over in their grave today. And that was important. It gave businesses certainty and confidence that they could invest in the future. Third, the government rejected the notion that it was the federal government's job to stimulate consumer demand. We heard about how there was no stimulus. There also was not pressures or unusual pressures in any case on employers to keep wages high. There was a commission in which then Commerce Secretary Herbert Hoover participated, arguing for what many today would consider to be the standard approach, which is when you have a downturn, you want to have upward pressure on wages. The idea is that people can be paid more, even though the economy is doing bad, they might spend more, and their spending would increase production, jumpstart the economy, help weather the storm, and get us back to a solid footing. That's very standard economics today. But this, at the time, was only a commission. There was no official high-wage policy that was implemented from that. The employers of the 1920s, therefore, did what sort of a market would suggest you ought to do. They let wages fall or stay stable. Certainly it's painful when wages are cut, but if the choice is between being laid off and having high unemployment or lowering wages, I think most employees, certainly employers, would much prefer to have a somewhat lower wage, but still to have a job. The early 1920s downturn was handled in what was the traditional way at that time. And then later, of course, there's the Great Depression. It's sort of interesting, the Dow Jones Industrial Average actually tracks Coolidge's adult life. The first index came in 1896, the year after Coolidge graduated from Amherst College. And a stock crash in 20 or later in 29 wouldn't have been totally out of the ordinary. In that time, from 1896 until 1920, there had been at least 6 pretty severe crashes, what they used to call panics, of the stock market. 10%, losing, say, value of 10% or more per year. This was before 1920. But the economy had always recovered. And that certainly was the case, as Dr. Cochran explained well, with the 1920 crash. Painful, severe, and brief. Now let's move on to the 1929 crash of the stock market, which of course, then later we had a Great Depression. In 1929, the Dow dropped from 381 on September 3rd, 1929 to below 300, and then even further. One thing people don't, I think almost no one knows or appreciates is that it dropped, then it came back before dropping further several months later. Hoover was a Republican like Coolidge, but Hoover led Congress in very different policies than those applied in the early 1920s. In all the 3 areas that I just discussed, the Hoover administration followed basically nearly the exact opposite of what Wilson, and then Harding and Coolidge followed earlier in the decade. So let's look again at the 3. Federal spending. When it came to spending, the idea by now was to spend to help bring recovery. And the Hoover administration certainly did spend. First, not too dramatically. In the early years of the Hoover administration, maybe 5 or 6% increase from the year before that. But by 1932, federal spending had increased 30% year over year. And of course, that only accelerated under the Roosevelt administration. In fact, by 1940, annual federal spending had tripled over its 1929 level. Tax policy. When it came to the budget, of course, the government was now in trouble. To spend on stimulus, that meant that this new spending I just talked about, you had to finance it, and they had the idea to do that through higher taxes. So rather than cutting taxes, as they had done to start the decade, taxes went up dramatically. The top rate went from Coolidge's low of 25% all the way to 63% by 1932. So not just a small tax increase, a dramatic one. And third, what was the policy on wages and labor? Well, this time Hoover was the president, not just the Commerce Secretary, so he had a little bit more authority. When the time came, he pushed for strong upward pressure on wages, and he got it. This was both through pressure campaigns, sort of informally, the bully pulpit, as you might call it, as well as official policy. In November of 1929, on the pressure campaign front, he hauled in leading industrialists of the era. Henry Ford was there, DuPont was there, of course Mellon was part of the cabinet, he would have been there. And President Hoover, impressed upon them the importance that wages stay high. This was important for not just the workers, but for the whole country, that wages stay high, this high wage policy. The White House issued a press release following this meeting, and here's what the press release said. The president was authorized by the employers who were present at this morning's conference to state on their individual behalf that they will not initiate any movement for wage reductions, and it was their strong recommendation that this attitude should be pursued by the society as a whole. They considered that, aside from the human considerations involved, the consuming power of the country will thereby be maintained. So the idea was, if we can keep wages high, not only will the workers do well, but our whole country will survive this depression and will come out of it. So Hoover got his higher wages. Wages and worker earnings remained steady or even increased in 1929, 1930, 1931. And then through official policy, the Davis-Bacon Act, Hoover and Congress ensured that anyone who got a federal contract would pay the top rate on union wages. The businesses went along, as I said. Henry Ford himself made similar statements to that which were in the press release. But of course, they went along, but that didn't change the underlying economics of their situation. The only choice, if they couldn't reduce wages and allow prices to readjust, as the professor mentioned, was to lay people off or hire people less. So in a trade-off between wages and unemployment, the policy result was very high unemployment. Although wages stayed somewhat high, by 1932, unemployment was 25%, and unemployment was over 14 or 15% for the entire decade of the 1930s. The policy response from 1929, unfortunately, seems to be what we consider standard, what many of our textbooks tell us is the playbook. But the evidence suggests, certainly with these three policy areas, that we should maybe follow the playbook from the early 1920s. Thank you.
Matt, quick question before we open up to the floor. Did Hoover ever look at the implicit contradiction in asking for higher wages and then more than doubling taxes, giving with one hand and then taking back with the other? Did they ever reconcile that?
Well, we have some real Hoover experts in the audience, including George Nash, so I hesitate to make any definitive statement on what Hoover said or thought, and maybe George can fill us in the Q&A. But the high wage policy was embraced not just by Hoover, but by the whole country. I mean, the economists of the time, all agreed with this, and really went sort of unexamined for many decades. My mentor in college and Professor Richard Vedder wrote an entire book, Out of Work, on this question about the labor price and unemployment, and I would commend it to anyone to have a a
So did he have an opinion on the taxes?
Well, he embraced the high taxes, and then they went higher.
Yikes.
Could I add a word on the Great Depression stuff?
Yeah.
I'll make it short. I'm very interested by this meme that the boom of the 1920s inexorably led to the Depression of the 1930s. No economist believes this. Not even, I read a lot of left-wing economists and Keynesians. None of them. There's just no scholarly economic writing that has this idea. Everyone agrees the Great Depression came from the policy mistakes of the 1930s. We debate which ones are the important ones, but everyone agrees it's from the policy mistakes of the 1930s. Maybe raising marginal tax rates to 63%, maybe the Fed clamping down on the money supply, maybe allowing the banks to fail. That was Ben Bernanke's idea. The problems with the gold standard. Maybe it was the National Recovery Act, as Amity's book says. Maybe the contradiction of capitalism, the contradiction of trying to raise prices relative to wages in industrial monopolies and trying to raise wages relative to prices by unions, and somehow raising one relative to the other will make them both go up again. That completely makes no sense. So, or the political war on capital as well. This is what we debate. But there is no economic theory that says that somehow automatically the boom of the 20s had to lead and sow the seeds for the 30s. Everyone agrees it was the policy mistakes of the 1930s that caused the Great Depression and made it worse. We just argue about which ones.
Calvin, you're off the hook. That's great. Very good. I guess we ready for questions from the floor? We have somebody with a microphone? Yep. I can't see.
Such stuff, isn't it?
Hi, I'm Juliana from Demorest, New Jersey, and my question is about how you would respond to the common question that a lot of people have about the that it was the over speculation during the 1920s and the federal government sort of like letting it kind of like build up that led to the Great Depression. What is a good response to this?
Question is, how do you respond to arguments that over speculation in the 1920s led to a stock buildup?
Right. Well, I would say this, and Matt alluded to it. We've had lots of what I would call stock market corrections, not crashes. We had the stock .com bubble in 1999. We had the subprime mortgage meltdown in 2008, and Matt cited some from earlier history. In every case, we had a correction that came at the end typically of a boom period. This is not unusual in the U.S. economy, but there was only one that led to a depression, and I think, as Professor Cochran has pointed out, that was the policies of the 30s that caused that. And you look at what particularly what Roosevelt did during the 30s. Here you have a country in depression. So he raises taxes from, Hoover's 63% to 79%. Then he confiscates the gold savings of the country, and he does it at $20 an ounce and immediately raises the price to $35. You might say he confiscated the rest. I don't know how the Supreme Court let him get away with that. And then, third, he was just antithetical to business. What did he do with one of the greatest secretaries of the Treasury he's ever had, Andrew Mellon? He sicked the IRS on him. So how do you think businessmen felt? So to the extent animal spirits, which they talk about, ever play any role, they were certainly dampened in that period. I don't know, does that address your question?
I would just add, so it is normal in a period of rapidly evolving technology. We saw it actually, we've now had two .com booms where prices are just way over current earnings. Why? Because people, the radio is going to take over everything. The internet's going to take over everything. And then you kind of find out the limits of it. And there is a stock market correction. That's perfectly normal. The question is why in 1999 and then, this year we're having the end of that correction in the speculation, if you will, or the high prices of new technologies. And sometimes you get a tiny minor recession, and sometimes you get a horrible bank rush, a crash, and so forth. And it's not inherent in the speculation. It's in the bad policies and the fragile banking system and all the rest of it that happened. That 1929, stock market didn't cause the recession. It was a symptom of, when there's a slowdown, all those things that are only going to pay off in 10 or 20 years are suddenly worth a lot less. So yeah, it is not... even that little part, the high stock prices and not just the high investment and economic activity didn't necessarily sow the seeds of a recession afterwards.
Great. Any other questions? How about right here? I can see this person. Right here. Got the mic.
So I'm Kyle. I'm from Colorado. And I'm wondering that you guys have presented a lot of empirical evidence and just about why the early 20s recession was resolved so quickly and easily, maybe by Coolidge. Why did that not carry through? What exactly was missing in the next generation of political leadership? Like, what did they miss? Why didn't they respond in the same way?
Well, you can start, listening to the panel on taxes. Coolidge took taxes down from whatever it was, 70% during the war to ultimately 25%, guess what? That does two things. Leaves more money in people's pocket to buy things with, and two, leaves more money in their pocket to invest. Investment is very important to economic growth. You know, Roosevelt comes along, takes all the money away as well as the gold, and then says, well, why aren't you investing? So there were massively different policies, and I would defer to Dr. Cochran here, but I would suggest that not even Piketty and Paul Krugman would suggest raising taxes in a recession.
No, they would do it. So again, I told you, don't look at tax rates matter, not tax amounts. Keynesians look at it as you don't want to take money, you want stimulus in a recession. So they would say that, but for the wrong reasons. But I think ideas matter. Hoover was, so I'm from the Hoover Institution, so I have to speak a little ill of the namesake. He was famous for being Mr. Fix-It. He went in and was kind of a command and control guy, and he solved the Belgian famine during the First World War. And his attitude was Mr. Fix-It. And Roosevelt was similarly ideologically, I'm in there to do great things, not to keep the institutions going within my constitutional limits. In fact, there's a great quote in Amity's book about how Roosevelt said, wow, Hoover did all the things that we want to do, and now we get to take credit for it. I would say I'm a little different on the gold. Actually, there was a problem with the gold standard. It was not an ideal monetary arrangement and led to far more deflation than you had to have. So actually getting rid of the gold standard was I think, the good thing to do. And that's the economy started recovering pretty much the minute they got rid of gold.
I'd like to add one little thought. I was running BB&T in the early 1980s when Ronald Reagan took over. Well, preceding Reagan, we had phenomenal inflation. Things seemed to be out of control, and Reagan's solution was not that different from what Coolidge did. He deregulated all kind of stuff. He cut tax rates dramatically, which he was highly criticized for, and yet it made huge improvements in the economy. And then, of course, that was followed by 10 years of great economic growth. And what's interesting is the economists didn't really seem to learn lessons. I'm not saying they didn't, in theory, learn lessons, but the ones that spoke out from Coolidge or from Reagan in terms of really creating more economic freedom.
Some of us did.
A few of you did. Yes, John did. But not enough.
I might add just one little point. Hoover, he's sort of castigated, and they talk about Hoovervilles, and the problem was he didn't care and he didn't do anything, I think is certainly what I learned in high school, which is another myth. Sort of the problem of the Hoover policy in this era was not that he did nothing, it's that he did too much. And he raised taxes, he had all these ideas, and that then was only amplified during the Depression under the New Deal, which again often we're taught in high school is what saved us from the Depression. These things sort of wore out the market, allowed prices not to readjust, and made what was a recession a very bad depression.
But it's an interesting lesson in political life. So creating a great crisis that you can then go down in history as being the savior of the crisis, even though it never got better under your term. That's how you get your name on the statues, and just quietly minding the store and letting the economy boom. Well, you're Mr. Coolidge.
Hey, Francisco Camacho from Tennessee. I also go by AJ. Take your pick. Anyway, my question is actually rather like Juliana's. Since you all are trying to convince us about the causes of the Great Depression, I'm looking for another rebuttal because the most compelling argument I've typically heard is that the root cause of the Depression was the overproduction of agriculture, especially of wheat. Prices dropped, farms went broke, and that's essentially the original catalyst of this whole situation. To me, that even seems like a compelling argument for farming subsidies, but I imagine you all have a response to that, so I'd really love to hear it.
Agriculture is a small part of GDP, and agriculture since, when did we start at 8,000 BC, has always been a volatile thing. It used to be a bigger factor. So I don't see how a bad wheat crop makes General Motors stop selling cars. It's just not that big a deal. And later in the Depression, first there's a bumper crop of too much wheat, and then there's a dust bowl and not enough wheat. It's sort of like climate change. It's always, it's either raining too much or too little, and it's always the problem of capitalism.
Hi, I'm Yash Manglik from Minneapolis, Minnesota. Mr. Cochrane, you mentioned the promise of artificial intelligence. What sort of technologies might have that same S-curve adoption graph, and what sort of policies should be adopted to ensure that they cause the same flourishing that we saw in the 20s?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a techno-optimist. One of the biggest debates going on in economics now is growth over. Think about how your and my great parents and grandparents lived. This is, my point about the 1920s, the economy of the outhouse, the horse, the kerosene lamp, and silence. It was just dramatic. Well, that period of growth, is that over now? Was this all about fossil fuels and electromagnetism? I'm an optimist, and AI is just amazing what they're now doing it. And I think biotechnology is also one of the most amazing things. We at least live a comfortable life. People in a lot of the rest of the world need to join our standard of lives. What could be more important at this point than health and longevity? And I think we're on the cusp of that. Maybe yes, maybe no, but I don't know, and you don't know, and I know the federal government doesn't know. So, maybe fund some basic research, but try to do that a little better than they're doing now, and then get the heck out of the way. Allow new companies with new ideas to come in and innovate, even though that makes the existing companies very unhappy. That kind of dynamism of new ideas and displacing old companies with new companies, that's what brings growth, not 5-year plans, industrial policies, spend more money at whatever the Chinese think that they want to spend money at this year. That's a system we know doesn't work.
As I mentioned, I was the president of the Cato Institute, and Cato publishes what they call the Human Progress Index. And it's very interesting, from the evolution of Homo sapiens for thousands of years until the late 1700s, early 1800s, there was no improvement in the quality of life, just flat. And then starting in the early 1800s and accelerating rapidly after that, particularly in the late 1800s, there's this curve, and the quality of life expectancy is unbelievable, the percentage improvement. And it's not just the United States or Western Europe, it's the whole daggum world. And it was caused basically by innovation and creativity. And that even though we don't have as much freedom as we'd like to have, we have some restrictions we don't have, but if you look at human progress, innovation, creativity, which is based on human freedom, it allows people to think differently and do different things, has driven up the standard of living in the world unbelievable.
But I want to add, that is the economic problem right now. People ask you, what's the problem? The slowdown in growth is the problem. In the post-war era, we grew 4% a year. Now we're growing maybe 1.5% to 2% a year. That is just a disaster over decades. And getting back to strong growth that's more important than just about anything else.
One of the ideas I would have, John, is to reduce the tax on invested capital, because all of this creativity and growth has come out of someone risking their capital on a great new idea, whether it's artificial intelligence or whether it's a new medication or whatnot. If you stimulate investment and don't get in the way, I would be on the side that growth will continue.
Absolutely. Somebody said the right corporate tax is zero. Yes, the tax on investment, right tax on investment is zero. Let's throw out the income tax. This is an idea from 1910. 13. Why did we have an income tax? Well, that's because, why did they have a window tax in medieval England? Because you could count the windows. In 1913, it was kind of the thing the government could grab. It makes no sense from an economic perspective to have an income tax. So we built this steam engine of a tax system, because that's what we know how to do, steam in 1910, and we've still got it. Exhibit A is President Trump's taxes, scandalously leaked, but we looked at it and it just left the news. Why did it leave the news? because it didn't have any of the partisan points people wanted to make. You just got to see how a very wealthy investor takes advantage of all the incredible amount of loopholes and special deals, 400 or some separate limited liability corporate pass-throughs. What are we talking about here? That the rottenness of that Swiss cheese ought to be just exhibit A. Throw this darn thing out and get a sensible 21st century tax system that does what Mellon said: raise revenue from the government at minimum economic distortion. We know how to do it. I won't give you a tax plan now, but just get rid of the whole darn thing.
Yeah. I think we have time for one more question. We're going to go to the back of the room. I haven't been able to see that before.
Yeah, Phil Magnus, American Institute for Economic Research. My question pertains to the academic theories about the Great Depression. Granted that most economists, left, right, or anywhere in between, do not accept this narrative about the 1920s causing the Great Depression, but the historians do. If you read 10 out of 10 college textbooks, they repeat some underconsumptionist theory of the Great Depression. My question would be, what do we do about that? How do we bridge that knowledge gap?
I think we continue to fund the Coolidge Scholarship Program, which spreads the word slowly but surely to the best and the brightest young minds in America and exposes them to the real history, not the fake history.
Yeah, academic history is so busy shooting itself in the foot that probably it'll be rebuilt again in a generation and we can get something serious.
All right, we do have time for one more question. Go ahead. Yeah, you. Give him the mic.
It's coming.
I got you. Excuse me. Sorry. Put your phone off. Hi, I'm Alex Bavalsky from New York City. My question is on, given Coolidge's belief in liberty and free markets and the mistakes of the federal government we have seen vis-a-vis currency manipulations, such as with quantitative easing, and more recently, the lack of regulation leading to the collapse of alternative currencies such as cryptocurrency, FTX is what I'm talking about. Should we deregulate cryptocurrencies and such similar alternative 21st century currencies?
My answer, my opinion is yes. I don't think there's any reason the federal government, the Federal Reserve needs to be in the cryptocurrency business. I think the markets will correct. You know, if you think about most cryptocurrencies, they're just pure speculations anyway. There's nothing there. And if you want to speculate, great. If you lose, you lose. If you win, you win. But I think that's what, in a free society, people should be able to take that kind of risk.
We had this a long time ago. It was called the tulip bulb craze. And people put tons of money in tulip bulb and drove them up to crazy prices. And the difference between cryptocurrencies and the tulip bulb is when the cryptocurrency goes to zero, you will not be able to plant it and get a nice flower.
So I'm a little more sympathetic. You asked three questions. So QE, basically QE, I view entirely as marketing for the Federal Reserve to pretend it was doing something. QE, they took your 20s and gave you 2 5s and a 10. Does that make any difference? Neither on the way up or on the way down. Really, inflation comes from fiscal policy, not so much from the Fed, something I think I mean, it's just bloody obvious. And I'm the luckiest guy in the world. I wrote a book on inflation saying it's all from fiscal policy, and then the government handed people $5 trillion worth of checks, and we got inflation. Thank you. Ought to be good for my book sales, but a warning sign about the Fed. Crypto is new technology, but nothing new in terms of what we know about how money and asset markets work. Unbacked money is volatile and eventually ends up being zero. That'll come. Backed crypto is an interesting concept. You know, we've invented now the 19th century bank, sort of the wildcat bank, and the ones that pretend to be backed but aren't really. We'll eventually get to really backed crypto, which is just the reinvention of the money market fund, and that's probably useful. But we are at a crossroads. We all need 21st century electronic money, and crypto is one way of getting that. And we also need to preserve anonymity. And this is we have anonymity with cash, but anonymity also leads to tax evasion and illegal activity. If we have completely electronic money that is totally anonymous, which, that's important for political liberties to have some anonymity in money, but then that explodes, that makes it very much cheaper to be ransomware and so forth. And then you don't want to, all laws you don't want to enforce, like laws against getting money out of China or into Ukraine. Those are good things. So how do you handle the balance between the vital importance of an anonymity in transactions? I mean, if the government knows this is the problem with central bank currency. If the government knows every transaction you ever made, welcome to China. Goodbye your political liberties. On the other hand, if it doesn't know any transaction you made, goodbye tax collection. And we need to collect some taxes to actually make the currency government run. So a well-designed electronic currency is an important policy thing for today, and it's not super easy. And crypto isn't a very computationally efficient thing for that. So crypto is a wonderful thing, and it's an answer searching in search of a question, and we'll see what the question turns out to be. And I'm certain that no government agency is going to figure out what that question ought to be.
All right.